What if you lived in a country where you could be punished for smiling on the wrong day, or where only one haircut was allowed? Welcome to North Korea, one of the most secretive and bizarre places on Earth. Today we're diving into 12 crazy things North Korea does, and number 9 will seriously blow your mind. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this is going to get wild. Number 1. Only one internet. In North Korea there's no Google, YouTube, or Instagram. People only have access to a state-controlled intranet called Kwangmyong. It's filled with propaganda and filtered content, so no cat videos or trending TikToks here. North Korea's approach to internet access represents one of the most extreme cases of digital isolation in the modern world. Let me help you understand the deeper implications of what you've described. When we think about the internet, we often take for granted that it's a global network where information flows freely across borders. But North Korea shows us how a government can create what's essentially a parallel internet that serves very different purposes. Kwangmyong, the intranet you mentioned, operates on a completely different principle than the global internet. Think of it like the difference between a private library curated by a single organization versus a vast public library system where anyone can contribute books. The state-controlled intranet contains only content that aligns with the government's messaging and educational goals. This creates what scholars call an information ecosystem that's fundamentally different from what most of us experience. In countries with open internet access, people encounter diverse viewpoints, entertainment from around the world, and information that may challenge official narratives. But when access is restricted to curated content, it shapes not just what people know, but how they think about the world. The absence of platforms like YouTube or Instagram isn't just about missing entertainment, it's about missing the informal cultural exchange that happens when people share their daily lives, creative expressions, and perspectives across borders. These platforms, for all their flaws, create connections that transcend national boundaries. What do you think might be the long-term effects on a society when information flows are controlled this extensively? How might this shape how people understand their place in the world? Number 2. Fake cities. There's an entire fake city near the border with South Korea. It's called Kijongdong, and it looks beautiful from afar. But nobody lives there. It's a showpiece built to fool outsiders and spread propaganda. This is a perfect example of what we might call theatrical geopolitics, where nations create elaborate performances designed to project power or influence perceptions across borders. Let me help you understand why Kijongdong exists, and what it reveals about how countries use architecture and urban planning as tools of psychological warfare. First, consider the context. The Korean demilitarized zone isn't just a border, it's one of the most heavily monitored boundaries in the world. Every structure, every light, every visible activity becomes part of an ongoing communication between two nations that are technically still at war. Think of it like two neighbors who've been feuding for decades, and everything they do in their front yards is partly meant to send a message to the other. You can see something that looks impressive, but you can't easily verify what's actually happening inside. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The very act of building and maintaining a fake city sends its own message. It tells observers that North Korea has the resources and organizational capacity to construct elaborate deceptions. In some ways, the artifice itself becomes a demonstration of state power. This connects to a broader pattern you'll find throughout history, where authoritarian governments use what we call Potemkin villages, impressive facades that mask different realities behind them. The original Potemkin villages were supposedly fake settlements built to impress Catherine the Great during her travels through Russia in the 1780s. What makes Kijongdong particularly fascinating is how it functions in the modern age of satellite imagery and advanced surveillance. North Korean planners know that their performance will be scrutinized with sophisticated technology, yet they continue maintaining this elaborate stage set. This suggests they believe the psychological impact is worth the considerable investment required. Think about this. What does it tell us about how nations think about perception versus reality when they're willing to build entire cities that serve no practical purpose for their own citizens? Number 3. You don't choose where you live. In North Korea, the government assigns your home based on your loyalty. If they think you're a threat, you'll be sent to a remote village or worse. a labor camp. This point reveals one of the most fundamental ways that authoritarian control operates, through what political scientists call spatial control, or the manipulation of where people can live and move. Let me help you understand how this system works and why it's so effective as a tool of social control. First, let's establish the basic concept. In most democratic societies, we take for granted that we can choose where to live based on factors like job opportunities, family connections, personal preferences, or economic circumstances. This freedom of movement is actually a cornerstone of individual liberty that we rarely think about until it's absent. Now imagine a system where your residence becomes a direct reflection of your perceived loyalty to the state. This creates what we might call a geography of trust, where physical location becomes a visible marker of your standing with the government. Think of it like a massive sorting system where the government acts as the ultimate landlord, placing people where it believes they can do the most good or the least harm. Here's how this works in practice and why it's so psychologically powerful. When the government controls housing assignments, it can separate potential opposition groups, isolate dissidents, and reward loyalty with better living conditions. People who live in prestigious areas near the capital know they're there because the state trusts them. People sent to remote regions understand this as punishment or warning. This system creates several layers of social control that reinforce each other. First, there's the direct physical control. You literally cannot organize opposition if you're scattered across remote locations. Second, there's the psychological pressure. Knowing that your housing depends on perceived loyalty makes people extremely careful about their words and actions. Third, there's the social stratification. Where you live becomes a public signal of your status in the regime's hierarchy. Consider how this differs from economic segregation that exists in many countries. In market economies, wealth often determines where people live, but theoretically, anyone can improve their economic situation and move. In a politically controlled housing system, your ability to live. Forget personal style. North Koreans can only choose from 28 state-approved hairstyles, and get this. Men can't have long hair, and women must follow gender-specific cuts. Yes, even hair is political here. This detail about hairstyles might seem trivial at first glance, but it actually opens a window into understanding one of the most sophisticated aspects of authoritarian control: how governments can shape identity and social behavior through seemingly minor regulations. Let me walk you through why controlling something as personal as hairstyles represents a particularly insightful case study in social engineering. First, let's establish the foundational concept here. Personal appearance, especially hairstyles, serves as what sociologists call identity markers. Visible signals that communicate information about who we are, what groups we belong to, and how we see ourselves. Think about how different hairstyles in your own culture might signal different things. Professional versus casual, traditional versus rebellious, conformist versus individualistic. Hair becomes a form of non-verbal communication that operates constantly in social interactions. Now, when a government steps in to control these identity markers, something profound happens. The state essentially becomes the author of personal identity, deciding not just what people can do, but how they can present themselves to the world. This creates what we might call enforced uniformity that goes far deeper than simple dress codes. Let's break down why this particular form of control is so psychologically effective. When you wake up each morning and look in the mirror, you're seeing a reflection that has been shaped by government decree rather than personal choice. This constant reminder of state control becomes internalized in a way that more distant policies might not. Every time you see your reflection, every time someone looks at you, there's a subtle reinforcement of the idea that individual preferences are subordinate to state preferences. The gender-specific nature of these regulations adds another layer of complexity that's worth examining carefully. By mandating different hairstyles for men and women, the government isn't just controlling appearance. It's enforcing very specific ideas about gender roles and social organization. This connects to a broader pattern where authoritarian systems often rely on rigid social categories to maintain order. When people fit into clearly defined roles, they're easier to predict and control. Number 5. Different calendar. North Korea doesn't follow the normal calendar. Their year zero starts in 1912, the birth year of Kim Il-sung, the country's founder. So while it's 2025 for us, it's Juche year 114 over there. This calendar system reveals one of the most fundamental ways that political movements attempt to reshape human consciousness, by literally changing how people experience and think about time itself. Let me guide you through understanding why this matters so much more than it might initially appear, because we're looking at something that goes to the very heart of how societies create meaning and identity. First, let's establish what's happening here conceptually. Every calendar system makes a statement about what events are most important in human history. When we use the Gregorian calendar and say it's 2025, we're implicitly organizing all of human experience around the birth of Jesus Christ. That moment becomes year zero from which everything else is measured. Now, North Korea has created what we call the Juche calendar, which places Kim Il-sung's birth in 1912 as the pivotal moment in human history. Think about what this does psychologically for people living within this system. Every time someone writes a date, every time they think about when something happened, they're being reminded that the most important event in all of human history was the birth of their country's founder. This isn't just about changing numbers, it's about fundamentally restructuring how people understand the flow of history and their place within it. Here's where it gets particularly sophisticated from the perspective of social engineering. The Juche calendar doesn't completely replace international dating systems. North Korea still needs to interact with other countries and participate in international organizations, so people living there often need to mentally translate between two different ways of organizing time. This creates what we might call temporal bilingualism, where citizens must constantly navigate between their domestic time system and international time systems. Let me help you understand the historical precedent for this, because North Korea didn't invent this approach. Throughout history, revolutionary movements have often attempted to restart time as a way of signaling that they represent a completely new era in human development. The French Revolution created a revolutionary calendar that made 1792 year one. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia tried something similar. These attempts recognize something profound. If you can change how people think about time, you can change how they think about everything else. But there's something particularly interesting about the North Korean approach that distinguishes it from these historical examples. Rather than starting from a political revolution or the founding of a new government, they start from the birth of an individual person. This personalizes the entire flow of history in a way that's quite remarkable. Every year that passes becomes another year in what we might call the Kim Il-sung era, making the founder not just a political leader but literally the organizing principle of time itself. Now, let's think about how this affects younger generations who have grown up entirely within this system. If you're someone who has never experienced any other way of organizing time, the Juche calendar doesn't feel artificial or imposed. It simply feels like the natural way that time works. This creates what scholars call generational norm. Number 8, crying is mandatory. When a leader dies, citizens are required to cry in public, or risk being jailed. It's not mourning, it's mandatory emotion. There's even footage of people sobbing hysterically, likely out of fear. This requirement of mandatory public grief represents perhaps the most psychologically invasive form of control we've encountered yet, because it attempts to regulate not just behavior or even thoughts, but the spontaneous expression of human emotion itself. Let me guide you through understanding why this practice is so profoundly disturbing and effective by starting with the most basic question. What does it mean for a government to control not just what you do, but what you feel, or at least what you must appear to feel? First, let's establish the foundation by thinking about what genuine grief and mourning represent in human experience. When we lose someone important to us, crying and mourning serve crucial psychological functions. They help us process loss, they signal to others that we need support, and they represent an authentic response to genuine emotional pain. These expressions emerge naturally from our internal emotional state and connect us to other people through shared human experience. Now imagine a system that takes this most intimate and authentic human response and transforms it into a performance requirement enforced by the threat of imprisonment. What we're looking at is the deliberate corruption of one of the most fundamental aspects of human emotional life. Let me help you understand the psychological mechanisms at work here. When people are forced to display emotions they don't genuinely feel, something profound happens to their relationship with their own internal emotional life. Psychologists call this emotional labor when it happens in work contexts, but here we're seeing something far more comprehensive. The systematic requirement that citizens perform emotional responses that align with state expectations rather than their authentic feelings. Think about what this does to the individual psyche over time. When you're required to cry publicly to demonstrate loyalty, you're being forced to use your body's natural grief responses as a tool of political communication. Your tears become a form of speech that declares your allegiance to the regime. This creates what we might call emotional alienation, a disconnection between your genuine feelings and your required expressions. Here's where it becomes particularly psychologically sophisticated. The requirement isn't just that you appear sad, it's that you demonstrate intense visible grief that can be observed and evaluated by others. This means that citizens must not only suppress their authentic emotional responses, but they must actively generate convincing performances of emotions they may not feel. Think about the mental energy and psychological stress required to consistently produce believable emotional displays under threat of punishment. Let me walk you through how this connects to the broader system of control we've been examining. Remember the three-generational punishment system where your actions can destroy your family's future? Now, imagine that your failure to cry convincingly enough at a state funeral could trigger those consequences not just for you, but for your children and grandchildren. The stakes for emotional performance become, well, catastrophically high. Consider also how this interacts with the mandatory military service and the culture of surveillance it creates. When everyone has spent years being trained to observe and report on others' behavior, citizens become skilled at evaluating whether their neighbors' emotional displays meet state expectations. The requirement to cry publicly creates a situation where everyone becomes both performer and audience in a theater of mandatory grief. Now, let's examine the footage you mentioned of people sobbing hysterically. This is where we can see the psychological complexity of the system in action. Some of those tears might indeed be genuine, not grief for the dead leader, but terror about the consequences of not performing grief convincingly enough. Others might represent what psychologists call emotional contagion, when being surrounded by intense emotional displays triggers genuine emotional responses, even when the original cause is artificial. Here's a thinking question to help you grasp the deeper implications. If you were required to cry publicly every time a political leader died, and you knew that the authenticity of your tears would be evaluated by neighbors who had been trained to report suspicious behavior, how might that change your relationship with your own emotions? How would it affect your ability to trust your genuine feelings in other situations? The system creates what we might call performed authenticity, a situation where citizens must become skilled at generating convincing displays of emotions they don't genuinely feel. Over time, this can lead to a kind of psychological splitting where people develop two separate emotional lives, their private, authentic feelings and their public performed emotions required for survival. Let me help you understand the historical context that makes this particularly significant. Throughout history, authoritarian regimes have required public displays of loyalty, parades, rallies, demonstrations of support. But requiring specific emotional responses goes beyond behavioral compliance into the realm of psychological control. The regime isn't just demanding that you act loyal, it's demanding that you feel loyal, or at least that you perform feeling loyal so convincingly that the distinction becomes meaningless. Think about how this connects to the controlled information environment we discussed earlier. When people have limited access to independent information about their leaders, and when they're required to perform intense grief when those leaders die, it becomes psychologically easier to convince yourself that the grief is genuine rather than constantly acknowledging that you're living a lie. The performance can become internalized as a way of reducing the psychological stress of constant emotional dishonesty. Number 9. No blue jeans. Wearing blue jeans is illegal because they symbolize Western capitalism. Black jeans? Sometimes okay. But blue? That's a fashion crime in North Korea. This ban on blue jeans opens up a fascinating window into understanding how authoritarian regimes use clothing and fashion as battlegrounds for ideological control. To help you fully grasp why something as seemingly trivial as the color of denim could become a matter of state policy, we need to build up from basic concepts about how symbols work in political systems. Let me start by establishing the foundational principle. Clothing is never just about covering the body or staying warm. Every society uses clothing as what anthropologists call symbolic communication, a way of sending messages about identity, values, and group membership without using words. Think about how you can often tell something about a person's profession, social status, or cultural affiliations just by looking at what they're wearing. Now, when governments understand this symbolic power of clothing, they can attempt to control those messages. Let's build on this foundation by examining why blue jeans specifically became such a powerful symbol. During the Cold War era, blue jeans represented something quite specific to people around the world. They symbolized American youth culture, individual freedom of expression, and the consumer capitalism that produced endless varieties of consumer goods for personal choice. Blue jeans weren't just pants, they were a visible Number 7. Three-generational punishment. If you commit a crime against the regime, your entire family, including children and grandchildren, can be punished. It's called guilt by association, and honestly, it's one of the most terrifying laws in the world. This system of three-generational punishment represents one of the most psychologically devastating forms of social control ever implemented by a modern state. To help you understand why this practice is so profoundly effective at maintaining political control, we need to examine how it exploits some of the deepest aspects of human psychology and social bonding. Let me start by establishing the basic mechanism and then build toward understanding its broader implications. The concept is deceptively simple. When someone is deemed to have committed a political crime, not only are they punished, but their parents, spouse, children, and even grandchildren face consequences. This creates what we might call inherited guilt. The idea that political wrongdoing creates a kind of moral contamination that spreads through family bloodlines. Now, let's think about what this does to human decision-making. Consider how most people think about taking risks in their own lives. You might be willing to accept personal consequences for your actions, especially if you believe strongly in a cause. But would you be willing to accept those same consequences if you knew they would also fall on your children and grandchildren who had no choice in your decision? This system transforms every potential act of dissent into a moral dilemma about whether you have the right to make choices that will affect innocent family members. Here's where the psychological sophistication of this system becomes clear. The regime isn't just threatening potential dissidents, it's recruiting their own family members as unwitting agents of social control. When your actions can destroy the lives of people you love most, your family becomes an internal surveillance system. Parents monitor their children's political expressions, spouses become cautious about their conversations, and children learn to be careful about what they say because they understand it could affect their entire extended family. Let me help you understand how this creates what sociologists call anticipatory compliance on a massive scale. People don't just avoid committing political crimes, they avoid any behavior that could potentially be interpreted as politically suspicious. This includes private conversations, reading materials, expressions of doubt or questioning, and even associating with people who might be considered politically unreliable. The system casts such a wide net of potential consequences that it effectively eliminates political discourse from daily life. Consider how this interacts with the natural human tendency to form communities and social movements. Normally, when people are dissatisfied with their government, they find others who share their concerns and organize collectively. But three-generational punishment makes this kind of organization almost impossible. Why would you risk joining any kind of political group when doing so could destroy not just your own life, but the lives of your children and their children? The system isolates potential dissidents by making political association itself a form of collective punishment. Now let's examine the intergenerational aspect more carefully, because this is where the system becomes particularly cruel and effective. Think about what it means for children to grow up knowing that their life opportunities are determined not by their own actions but by political decisions made by relatives they might never have met. A child whose grandfather was deemed politically unreliable faces restricted educational opportunities, limited job prospects, and social stigma that will follow them throughout their lives and potentially affect their own children. This creates what we might call inherited social status based on political loyalty rather than economic class or personal achievement. But unlike traditional class systems, where social mobility remains theoretically possible through economic success or education, political inheritance is essentially permanent. There's no way for someone to earn their way out of their family's political classification through their own behavior. Here's a thinking question to help you grasp the psychological impact. Imagine you're a parent in this system. How would you teach your children about right and wrong, about standing up for their beliefs, about moral courage, when you know that acting on moral principles could destroy their entire future? How do you balance teaching them to be good people with keeping them safe? The system also creates what we might call political genetics, the idea that political loyalty or disloyalty is somehow hereditary. This connects to broader patterns of how authoritarian regimes think about identity and social organization. By treating political attitudes as inheritable traits, the system reinforces the idea that some people are naturally loyal to the state, while others are inherently dangerous. This pseudo-scientific approach to political control has historical parallels in how various regimes have justified persecution of entire ethnic or social groups. Let me walk you through how this system interacts with the other forms of control we've discussed. Remember the mandatory military service where everyone spends a decade learning to prioritize collective loyalty over individual desires? Now imagine that this training is reinforced by the knowledge that individual actions can destroy multiple generations of your family. The military service teaches people to subordinate their individual will to collective authority, and the three-generational punishment system provides a permanent personal reason to maintain that subordination even after military service ends. Consider also how this connects to the assigned housing system. When your family's housing assignment reflects your political status, and when that status can be inherited across generations, the physical landscape becomes a visible map of political loyalty. Neighborhoods become sorted not just by economic class, but by political heritage. Children grow up understanding that where they live reflects their family's political standing, which reinforces the idea that political loyalty is a family characteristic, rather than an individual choice. The psychological trauma created by this system extends far beyond the immediate punishment. Families live with what we might call anticipatory grief, the constant awareness that their actions could destroy the lives of people they love most. This creates chronic stress that affects not just decision-making about political matters, but approaches to all aspects of life. People become hyper-vigilant about potential political interpretations of their behavior, leading to self-censorship that goes far beyond what the regime might actually enforce. Here's another way to think about the comprehensive nature of this control. The system doesn't just punish political dissent after it happens, it prevents political dissent from forming in the first place by making the potential costs so catastrophic that most people can't even allow themselves to think critically about the government. The three-generational punishment. Here's a thinking question to help you grasp the broader implications. If you lived in a society where your clothing choices were constantly evaluated for their political meaning, how might that change your relationship with self-expression and personal identity? Would you gradually internalize the government's symbolic interpretations, or would you maintain your own understanding of what your clothes mean to you? Let's examine how this clothing control connects to the comprehensive system of social management we've been exploring. Remember the mandatory emotional displays and the three-generational punishment system? Now imagine that your choice to wear blue jeans could be interpreted as a sign of Western influence or disloyalty, potentially triggering consequences not just for you but for your entire extended family. The stakes for fashion choices become extraordinarily high when they're embedded in a system of comprehensive political control. Consider also how this interacts with the assigned housing system and the social surveillance it creates. When your neighbors have been trained through military service to observe and report suspicious behavior, and when everyone understands that Western cultural symbols are politically dangerous, your clothing becomes subject to constant community monitoring. Getting dressed becomes not just a personal choice but a decision that will be evaluated by everyone you encounter throughout the day. The ban reveals something profound about how totalitarian systems think about cultural influence and ideological contamination. The regime operates on the theory that cultural symbols can gradually change how people think about political and economic systems. They're not just worried about fashion trends. They're concerned that exposure to Western cultural symbols might make citizens more receptive to Western political and economic ideas. Let me walk you through the historical context that makes this particularly significant. During the Cold War, both sides understood that culture could be a form of warfare. The United States promoted jazz music, Hollywood films, and consumer goods like blue jeans as ways of demonstrating the attractiveness of capitalist democracy. Socialist countries often responded by restricting access to these cultural products, recognizing their potential to influence political attitudes. The North Korean blue jeans ban represents a continuation of this cultural Cold War logic into the present day. Here's where the psychological sophistication becomes clear. The regime doesn't need to explain to citizens why blue jeans are dangerous. The ban itself communicates the message that Western cultural influence is a threat that must be actively resisted. Every time someone sees blue jeans and remembers they're forbidden, they're being reminded that their society is engaged in an ideological struggle against Western influence. The clothing ban becomes a daily reinforcement of the broader political narrative about defending Korean values against foreign contamination. Think about how this creates what we might call symbolic vigilance throughout the society. Citizens must constantly evaluate not just their own clothing choices, but the clothing choices of others for signs of dangerous Western influence. This transforms everyday social interactions into opportunities for political monitoring and reinforces the idea that ideological threats can appear anywhere, even in something as mundane as clothing. The distinction between acceptable and unacceptable clothing also creates opportunities for the regime to demonstrate both its control and its reasonableness. By allowing black jeans while banning blue ones, the government can claim that it's not being arbitrary or overly restrictive. It's making careful distinctions based on, what it says are legitimate concerns about cultural influence. This helps maintain the illusion that the restrictions are rational policy decisions rather than mechanisms of social control. Let me pose a synthesis question to help you understand how this fits into the broader pattern of control. How do you think clothing restrictions might work together with controlled information access, mandatory military service, and restricted housing assignments to create a society where Western ideas never have the opportunity to take root? Can you see how controlling cultural symbols might be just as important as controlling information for maintaining ideological uniformity? Number 10. Worshipping the leaders. Every home must display portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and they must be cleaned daily. Failing to care for these photos properly can lead to punishment or imprisonment. This mandatory portrait system represents perhaps the most intimate and psychologically penetrating form of ideological control we've encountered, because it transforms the private space of the home itself into a site of daily political ritual and state surveillance. Let me help you understand why this practice is so profoundly effective by starting with the most fundamental concept, the difference between public and private space in human psychology. Throughout history, humans have understood the home as a refuge from external social pressures, a place where you can let down your guard, express your authentic self, and exist without constant performance for others. The portrait requirement eliminates this psychological sanctuary entirely. Now, let's build up our understanding by examining what daily portrait cleaning actually means in practice. This isn't simply about keeping pictures dust-free. It's about creating a mandatory daily ritual that forces citizens to physically interact with images of their leaders in a way that mimics religious worship. Think about the physical actions involved. You must approach the portraits with care, handle them gently, clean them thoroughly, and ensure they remain in perfect condition. Your body is performing acts of reverence whether your mind agrees or not. Here's where the psychological sophistication becomes clear. The requirement transforms every citizen into what we might call a domestic priest who must perform daily maintenance rituals for state-mandated religious objects. But unlike traditional religious practice, which people choose based on personal belief, this worship is enforced by threat of imprisonment. The regime has successfully taken the intimate space of personal religious or spiritual practice and colonized it for political purposes. Let me walk you through how this creates what psychologists call behavioral conditioning through repetition. When you perform the same reverent actions toward the same objects every single day for years or decades, those actions gradually influence your psychological relationship with those objects and what they represent. Even if you initially clean the portraits reluctantly or cynically, the daily repetition of reverent behavior can slowly create genuine emotional attachments through what behaviorists call attitude-following behavior. Think about this from the perspective of family dynamics and child development. Children growing up in homes with mandatory portraits don't just learn that these leaders are important, they learn that caring for these images is a normal part of daily family life. They watch their parents perform these rituals every day, they participate in the cleaning themselves, and they internalize the idea that proper care of leader portraits is simple. Let me help you understand the historical and anthropological context that makes this practice particularly significant. Throughout human history, household religious practices have served as ways for families to express their deepest values and connect with what they consider sacred. The North Korean system takes this profound human tendency toward domestic spirituality and redirects it entirely toward political figures. This represents what we might call political religion, the transformation of governance into a form of worship that operates through the same psychological mechanisms as traditional religious practice. The daily cleaning requirement also creates what we might call sacred object psychology around the portraits. In religious traditions, sacred objects require special care, handling, and reverence because they're believed to embody or represent divine presence. By requiring this same level of careful maintenance for political portraits, the regime is attempting to trigger the same psychological responses that humans typically reserve for genuinely sacred objects. Think about how this transforms the economic and practical aspects of daily life. Families must budget for proper portrait frames, cleaning supplies, and periodic replacement of damaged images. They must organize their living spaces around the portraits, ensuring they're displayed in prominent, respectful positions. The simple act of redecorating or rearranging furniture becomes a political decision that must account for proper portrait placement. Every aspect of domestic life becomes subordinated to the requirements of political worship. Here's where the enforcement mechanism reveals the sophisticated psychology of the system. The portraits aren't just symbols, they're tests. Their condition serves as daily evidence of each family's political devotion that can be evaluated by authorities. A family that maintains perfect portraits demonstrates proper political consciousness, while a family with dusty or damaged portraits reveals dangerous political neglect. The objects themselves become surveillance devices that provide continuous information about citizen loyalty. Let me walk you through how this creates what we might call domestic theater, where private family life becomes a continuous performance for potential state observation. Even when no inspectors are present, families must maintain their portraits as if they might be evaluated at any moment. This transforms the home from a place of relaxation and authenticity into a stage where political loyalty must be constantly demonstrated through proper care of sacred political objects. Consider how this interacts with the mandatory emotional displays we discussed earlier. Just as citizens must perform grief when leaders die, they must perform daily reverence through portrait care. The combination creates a comprehensive system where both public and private emotional life becomes choreographed around state requirements. There's literally no space, public or private, where citizens can exist without performing political devotion. From the moment they start school, North Korean kids are taught to worship their leaders. History is rewritten, and the rest of the world is portrayed as evil and dangerous. This educational system represents what might be the most comprehensive and systematic approach to reshaping human consciousness that has ever been attempted, because it targets children during their most formative developmental years, when their understanding of reality is still being established. Let me guide you through understanding this step by step, starting with the most fundamental concept about how children learn about the world. Unlike adults, who already have established frameworks for understanding reality, children are in the process of building their basic mental models of how the world works, who can be trusted, what is normal, and what is dangerous. Their minds are extraordinarily receptive to information from authority figures, and they naturally assume that the adults teaching them are providing accurate information about reality. Now let's build on this foundation by examining what happens when an entire educational system is designed not to teach children how to think critically about the world, but rather to install a specific set of beliefs that serve political purposes. Traditional education aims to give students tools for independent reasoning, exposure to different perspectives, and the ability to evaluate information critically. But what we're looking at in North Korea is something fundamentally different, what we might call belief installation rather than education. Here's where the psychological sophistication becomes clear. The system doesn't just teach children facts about their leaders, it shapes the emotional and psychological frameworks through which children will interpret all future information. When young children are taught that their leaders are not just political figures but almost divine protectors who keep them safe from a dangerous world, this creates what psychologists call foundational beliefs that become extremely difficult to question later in life. Let me help you understand how historical revision works in this context and why it's so psychologically powerful. Think about how your own understanding of history shapes your view of the present world. The stories you learned about your country's founding, its role in major conflicts, and its relationships with other nations all contribute to your sense of national identity and your understanding of current events. Now imagine if those historical narratives were completely rewritten to support a specific political agenda, and you had no access to alternative sources of information to compare them against. The rewriting of history in North Korean education serves multiple psychological functions simultaneously. First, it creates a narrative where the current leaders are the heroes of an ongoing story of national survival and triumph. Second, it establishes the outside world as fundamentally threatening and hostile, which makes isolation and authoritarianism seem like necessary protective measures rather than oppressive policies. Third, it gives students a sense of being part of something historically significant and morally righteous, which provides psychological satisfaction and meaning. Think about this from the perspective of child development and identity formation. During their school years, children are not just learning facts, they're developing their sense of who they are, what group they belong to, and what role they should play in the world. When the educational system consistently reinforces the message that they are members of a special, chosen people, led by extraordinary leaders. Number 12. Fake supermarkets. Tourists are sometimes taken to supermarkets that are fully stocked, but fake. Locals can't shop there. They're just props to give visitors a false impression of prosperity. This practice of creating fake supermarkets for tourists reveals one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of how North Korea manages its international image while maintaining internal control. To help you understand why this deception is so significant, let me guide you through the layers of complexity involved in what we might call theatrical diplomacy. Let's start with the foundational concept of what these fake supermarkets are actually designed to accomplish. When foreign visitors see what appears to be a well-stocked store with abundant consumer goods, they're not just observing a retail space, they're being presented with visual evidence of a functioning economy and prosperous society. The regime understands that humans make rapid judgments about social and economic conditions based on physical evidence, and a supermarket full of products sends a powerful message about material well-being regardless of the actual economic reality. Now let me help you understand why this form of deception is particularly psychologically effective by thinking about how we process information about foreign countries. When most people visit an unfamiliar place, they rely heavily on what they can directly observe to form impressions about that society. A tourist walking through what appears to be a normal supermarket would naturally assume that local residents have access to the same abundance they're witnessing. The visual evidence feels more reliable than abstract statistics or government claims because it seems like unmediated reality. Here's where the sophistication of this deception becomes clear. The regime isn't just hiding poverty or scarcity, they're actively constructing an alternative reality that tourists can experience directly. Think about the enormous resources and planning required to maintain these theatrical spaces. Someone must stock the shelves with products, maintain the displays, ensure proper lighting and cleanliness, and coordinate the entire performance. This represents a massive investment in what we might call reality management designed specifically for international consumption. Let me walk you through how this connects to the broader system of social control we've been examining. Remember how every aspect of North Korean society is carefully managed to serve political purposes. The fake supermarkets represent the international dimension of this control. They're designed to manage not just domestic opinion, but foreign perceptions that could affect the regime's international standing and legitimacy. Consider how this practice creates what we might call parallel realities operating simultaneously in the same society. There's the reality that tourists experience, where supermarkets appear well-stocked and prosperity seems evident. Then there's the reality that local residents experience, where these same spaces are off-limits and actual shopping happens in very different conditions. The regime successfully maintains both realities without allowing them to contradict each other because access is so carefully controlled. Think about this from the perspective of the local residents who understand the true purpose of these spaces. They can see tourists being guided through fake supermarkets that they themselves are forbidden to enter. This creates what we might call performance awareness, where citizens become conscious participants in elaborate deceptions designed for foreign audiences. They understand that their society operates like a theater production, where different audiences see completely different shows. Here's a thinking question to help you grasp the psychological complexity. If you were a North Korean citizen who watched tourists being shown fake evidence of prosperity that you knew was false, how might that affect your understanding of truth, reality, and your government's relationship with the outside world? Would it make you more skeptical of official claims, or would it reinforce the idea that deception is necessary for national survival? Now let's examine how this practice reveals important aspects of how the regime thinks about international relations and domestic control. The fake supermarkets demonstrate that North Korean leaders understand their society doesn't meet international standards for prosperity and consumer access. The very existence of these deceptions acknowledges that the real conditions would create negative international impressions if observed directly. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting for the domestic population. The regime's willingness to create elaborate deceptions for foreigners can actually reinforce certain ideological messages for local citizens. When people see their government going to extraordinary lengths to protect national dignity and reputation through these performances, it can reinforce narratives about being surrounded by hostile foreign forces that must be kept from understanding the country's true circumstances. The fake supermarkets are part of a comprehensive system for managing information flows in both directions, preventing citizens from learning about outside conditions while preventing outsiders from learning about internal conditions. The practice also reveals something significant about how totalitarian systems think about economic performance and political legitimacy. In most societies, economic prosperity serves as evidence of successful governance that citizens can observe directly through their daily experiences. But when actual economic conditions don't support political legitimacy, regimes must find alternative ways to create the appearance of success. The fake supermarkets represent an extreme version of this challenge, creating prosperity for display purposes while actual prosperity remains absent. Consider how this theatrical approach to international relations might affect the psychology of government officials and citizens who participate in maintaining these deceptions. When significant resources and personnel are devoted to creating fake evidence of prosperity, it creates what we might call institutionalized dishonesty, where deception becomes a normal part of how the society interacts with the outside world. Here's another way to think about the comprehensive nature of this system. The regime doesn't just control what its own citizens know about the outside world, it also controls what the outside world knows about its citizens. The fake supermarkets are part of a two-way information control system that manages perceptions on both sides of the international boundary. Let me pose a synthesis question to help you understand how this fits into the broader pattern of comprehensive control. How do you think the practice of creating fake prosperity for international audiences might interact with the domestic systems of assigned housing, controlled information access, and mandatory political displays to create a society where the distinction between authentic and performed reality becomes increasingly meaningless? Can you see how managing international perceptions might become just another form of the theatrical performance that characterizes every aspect of life in this system? North Korea remains one of the world's most mysterious and controlled nations, and while many of these laws sound insane to us, they're a daily reality for millions. Which of these crazy things shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more mind-blowing content.